In order to critically analyze the extent to which the beneficiary principle is unnecessarily rigid, this presentation will begin with an explanation of what the beneficiary principle even is. This presentation will then move to detail the rationale behind the beneficiary principle, being split into the rule against remote vesting and the rule against excessive duration, before making three arguments as to why the beneficiary principle is not unnecessarily rigid. Finally, a conclusion will be stated which will summarize the analysis and arguments made. The beneficiary principle states that in order for a trust to be valid, there needs to be a beneficiary of the trust. This is explained by Sir William Grant in Morris v. Bishop of Durham in the following terms. There can be no trust over the exercise of which this court will not assume control. Every other trust must have a definite object. There must be somebody in whose favor the court can decree performance. Similarly, in Leahy v. Attorney General for New South Wales, the court further illustrated the requirement of a beneficiary in the following terms. A gift can be made to persons, but it cannot be made to a purpose or to an object. For a purpose or an object cannot sue. A non-charitable purpose trust must therefore be for the benefit of people who are specifically identifiable in some way. If the intended beneficiaries of such a trust are not identifiable, the beneficiary principle will invalidate the trust. However, as the beneficiary principle is a general rule, there are exceptions to this rule, which will be stated later in this presentation. This presentation will now explain the rationale behind the beneficiary principle. The rationale for the beneficiary principle is to avoid perpetuity, also known as the rule against perpetuity. Its aim is to prevent the retention of property within a group of persons for a period longer than the perpetuity period, and in doing so, tie it up for too long before someone else is able to deal with it as an outright owner. The property is said to be tied up in the trust because the identity of all the beneficiaries cannot be ascertained, and so it cannot be vested outright in them. The common law perpetuity period is measured in terms of a life or lives in being plus 21 years. Such a life or lives may be chosen expressly by the settlor, or may be implied if the life or lives are so related to the gift that it can be used to measure the date of the vesting of interest. To illustrate, in Re Moore, the question was whether a gift was void, as the testator attempted to define the perpetuity period as 21 years from the death of the last survivor of all persons who shall be living at my death. The gift was held to be void for uncertainty. As per Joyce J., it is impossible to ascertain when the last life will be extinguished, and it is therefore impossible to say when the period of 21 years will commence. This decision demonstrated that the courts sought to avoid uncertainty as to how long the trust property could be enjoyed following the vesting of the interest. In the United Kingdom, however, the rule has been altered by the Perpetuities and Accumulations Act 2009, which prescribes a 125-year perpetuity period. Malaysia has no statutory equivalent, so the common law perpetuity period is still followed. The rule against perpetuity can be classified into two categories, namely, the rule against remote vesting and the rule against excessive duration. The rule against remote vesting stipulates the maximum period of time in which the vesting of a future interest may be postponed. For example, if a settlor provides in their will that their property is to be held on trust for their firstborn for life, and then for their firstborn for life, and so on, their attempts to dictate the vesting of new interests too far into the future are liable to be invalidated by the rule against future vesting. The general rule is that in trust declared today, an interest will be only valid if it proves to arise within the statutory perpetuity period of 125 years under the Perpetuities and Accumulations Act 2009. The rule against remote vesting is arguably part of the court's attempt to balance the rights of the settler to dispose of his property and the beneficiary to enjoy the property so disposed. As Gardner phrases the balance in the following terms. A settlor cannot legally provide for assets to remain subject to a trust for longer than legal policy will tolerate. There comes a point where they must return into absolute ownership. It is this reversion of assets to absolute ownership rather than being subject to the trust that allows the balance to exist. Any earlier vesting with interest would invalidate the wishes of the settler. Any later would infringe on the rights of the beneficiary to enjoy the assets. The rule against excessive duration is closely related to the rule against inalienability. This rule invalidates any trust or interest required to be enjoyed for longer than the perpetuity period. This rule seeks to protect the right of the owner of property to dispose of such property, but does not concern its actual disposal. To illustrate, in re Nottage bequeathed a capital sum to trustees and directed them to use the interest generated by that sum to provide a cup to encourage yacht racing. However, the bequest did not state the duration that the income was to be used for this purpose. The gift was voided by the rule against inalienability. It amounted to a perpetual purpose trust since it would tie up the capital sum for an indefinite period. This would have extended the lifetime of the trust beyond the perpetuity period, making it unclear as to how the trustee should manage the trust properly. It is this uncertainty that the courts seek to prevent via the rule against excessive duration. This presentation will now provide arguments as to why the beneficiary principle is not unnecessarily rigid. The first argument is that the beneficiary principle is not unnecessarily rigid as it protects beneficiaries by ensuring that they can enforce their rights against trustees. A trust gives rise to obligations, and so there must be a beneficiary to whom the duties of a trustee are owed. Conversely, the beneficiaries have a correlative right to render the trustee accountable for his actions and, if necessary, compel performance of his obligations by court order. However, such rights can only be protected if the beneficiary has local standi to enforce the same. Purposes or objects cannot initiate proceedings against trustees because, as Lord Grant stated in Morris, there must be somebody in whose favor the court can decree performance. This means that the only beneficiaries who can enforce their equitable ownership rights against trustees are human beneficiaries who possess specifically identifiable characteristics and not purposes or objects with an abstract identity. This point was reiterated by Roxburgh Justice in Re Esther Settlement Trust, where it was stated the only beneficiaries are purposes and at present unascertainable persons. It is so difficult to see who could initiate proceedings. In requiring that every non charitable private purpose trust has an identifiable beneficiary, the courts in Morris and Re Astor ensured that they could protect the rights of the beneficiary to have the trust managed appropriately. To illustrate, despite charitable purpose trusts being designed to promote certain purposes, beneficiary rights in such trusts are nevertheless capable of being enforced and protected by the Attorney General. With reference to non charitable purpose trusts, however, it therefore becomes clear that the beneficiary principle is necessary to protect beneficiary rights in the trust property. The second argument is that the beneficiary principle is not unnecessarily rigid, as it protects beneficiaries by ensuring that the purpose of the trust is certain. The beneficiary principle requires that the purpose and terms of the trust be sufficiently clear to provide the trustee or court with sufficient guidance as to how to perform the trust. If the purposes of the trust were uncertain, there would be little way for the courts to control the trustee's conscience. In fact, as another ground for the decision in Re Aster, the trust failed for uncertainty. As per Justice Roxburgh, if an enumeration of purposes outside the realm of charities can take the place of an enumeration of beneficiaries, the purposes must be stated in phrases which embody definite concepts, and the means by which the trustee are to try to attain them must also be prescribed with a sufficient degree of certainty. Justice Roxburgh equated the significance of beneficiaries with defined, specifically achievable purposes for non charitable private purpose trusts. This would ensure that the courts can supervise the trustee's attempts at fulfilling this purpose and intervene to enforce such equitable obligations on the trustee, should the trustee's conscience fail. If the trust's purpose was uncertain, the trustee could consciously mismanage the trust property within this uncertainty, and the courts would have little way to correct such conscience. This principle was further illustrated in Re Endicott, where a testator transferred his residuary estate to a parish council for the purpose of providing some useful memorial to himself. The trust failed for uncertainty, with Lord Evershed stating, "No principle has greater sanctity of authority behind it than the general proposition that a trust, by English law, in order to be effective, must have ascertained or ascertainable beneficiaries." The testator did not specify who the beneficiaries were, nor did it express the purpose in a certain manner. It was incapable of supervision by the courts, and hence it failed. The beneficiary principle is therefore necessary to ensure that the beneficiaries are protected by ensuring the purpose of the trust is certain and subjecting the trust to the court's supervision. The third and final argument is that the beneficiary principle is not unnecessarily rigid, as it allows certain non charitable purpose trusts to exist as exceptions where it is deemed socially acceptable, being characterized by Justice Roxburgh in Re Aster as concessions to human weakness or sentiment. This accommodates legitimate purposes which do not fall within the charitable sphere. Such an exception occurs when a testator pays for a memorial monument for themselves. To illustrate, in Re Hooper, a testator's trust was intended to be used to maintain various graves and monuments for as long as the trustees could legally do so. This was upheld by the courts as it was valid for 21 years from the testator's death, and so did not violate the rule against perpetuity. Another exception occurs when a testator pays for religious ceremonies for souls to be performed in private. For example, in Bourne and Keene, the court held that trusts created for the private saying of masses could be upheld if they did not violate the rule against perpetuity. In both cases, the purpose of the trust was not charitable, and yet it was upheld by the courts as it did not violate the rule against perpetuity. This suggests that the beneficiary principle already permits a certain degree of flexibility, where such flexibility is socially appropriate and would give effect to the wishes of the testator, providing the testator greater control over the vesting of their property. These nuanced exceptions to the beneficiary principle thus ensure that the law is sufficiently flexible to fulfill the wishes of the testator where appropriate. In conclusion, the beneficiary principle exhibits a necessary rigidity through its general prohibition of non charitable purpose trusts in its attempt to protect the equitable rights of beneficiaries, uphold the wishes of settlers, and also provide a check on the conscience of trustees. Simultaneously, the existence of anomalous exceptions to the principle demonstrate that it is not entirely inflexible, instead reflecting a controlled flexibility within an otherwise rigid framework. The beneficiary principle is therefore not unnecessarily rigid, but appropriately strict to uphold the core principles of trust law while also remaining capable of controlled and limited adaptation.